Hello, everyone. I'm Kelsey Lemon, Senior Technical Marketing Manager for the VCF division here at Broadcom, and I want to welcome you to this video series for the Management Pack Builder in VMware Cloud Foundation. And so this series is really intended to equip you with both conceptual knowledge and practical skills to help you build your own management packs. And so at the end of this series, you're going to be able to do a couple things. You're going to be able to understand the intent behind the tool. You're going to be able to describe how it works, complete with insight into its architecture. You're going to be able to build a simple management pack directly within VCF operations so that you can all follow along with me and get some hands-on experience in your own VCF environments. And then finally, we're going to set you all loose in the wild, if you will, so that you can apply all those key learnings that you've discovered in this series to build your own third-party management packs, which is what we're going to do right here in this last video of the series. And so odds are, you won't have this integration to follow along with me, like in the last video, but the concepts will still apply to any third-party management pack that you're looking to capture. And so with that said, we're going to build a new management pack for Rubrik, which is a third-party data protection service that's often used in conjunction with VMware virtualization. And so, this is a really great use case because currently there's no management pack available for Rubrik in the marketplace. But we're going to fix that, right? We're going to do that by building our own management pack, where the end game is that this management pack is going to be able to allow us to see a representation of the Rubrik cluster within the topology of our network inventory. We're going to be able to use this management pack builder to show us the relationships from that Rubrik cluster to the VMs that it protects. And then it's also going to be able to display custom, VM properties from Rubrik, that's related to data protection directly within VMware Cloud Foundation operations. And so, before we start, just like in the last video, we've pulled the Rubrik API documentation that we're going to use as a reference while we build out our new management pack. And so to start, let's just go ahead. We're going to start building our new management pack. And so we're going to give the management pack a name, and then we're going to give it a description. And then we're going to define the source. And for the host name, we're going to specify a Rubrik reference environment that serves the Rubrik API, which we can then use throughout the rest of the design process. And so with that said, to save us a bit of time in the request section, we can also specify a base API path, which will be leveraged for every request, right? And so with that being said, we can also configure the default port as well as SSL behavior. And in this case, we're going to keep the defaults, so for authentication, we're going to specify a username and a password that can be used for a basic authentication, authorization. And then the management pack builder, I want to point out, can also support most session-based authentication as well as other custom API authentication configurations, right? And with that said, in the global request settings, we're going to specify here, we can use this as an opportunity to specify any additional headers, which the API may require to be the set of every request. Now, with that being said, we don't need any of this for Rubrik, and so we can just go ahead and move on. Okay, so with that, now that we've defined the source, it's time to define our API request, right? And for Rubrik, for this management pack, we're going to need two requests. The first will be for the cluster endpoint. We're going to optionally specify any, like I said, any headers, any query parameters or body that are specific to this request. And then we'll need to, as you can imagine, go ahead and test that request. And once it succeeds, we can save. And then we're going to do the same thing for our VMs, those endpoints. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that the responses from these requests will be cached and they will be used in the next section where we're going to be defining our objects. Now, one of the things that I also want to point out about Management Pack Builder is that it also allows you to create new objects or extend existing object types with new properties. And so for Rubrik, we're going to create a new cluster object type, and then we're going to extend that to the existing VMware VM object types with rubric related data protection properties. And so let's just go ahead and start by creating a new cluster object. We're going to start by specifying the object type. And in this case, we'll call it rubric cluster. We're going to select an icon to represent this object type in VCF operations. And now we can see that the management pack builder has extracted, all of those attributes, from the JSON response that's been cached, from the request that we defined in the previous section. Now we can select which attributes we need to define, for our rubric cluster objects. And so for this particular tutorial, we're going to keep it simple for now with the cluster ID, version, and the name. And so for each selected attribute, we can update the human-friendly label, and specify whether or not that attribute is a key performance indicator. And for a numeric attribute, we can also specify a unit and whether that attribute is a property or a metric. And so for these three, we're going to keep the defaults. And then finally here, we also need to define some metadata about our new cluster object type. First we need to define which attribute should be used as the cluster's instance name, for that object. And so in this case, it's pretty easy. We can just use the same name attribute. And then next, we're going to have to look at our object identifiers. We need to select one or more attributes that can be combined to uniquely identify this object in VCF operations. And this is particularly important because, since two rubric clusters could theoretically have the same name, we're going to use the ID attribute as its unique identifier. And with that said, that's it for defining our new rubric cluster object type. Now we can extend the existing VMware VM object type with rubric data protection properties. So what we're going to do first is that we're going to select a VCF operations target, and then we're going to use the filter to find the existing virtual machine object type from the vCenter adapter. Now we can select the data protection attributes from rubric that VMware Cloud Foundation will use in terms of response. And so we're going to take that and we're going to add that to our our virtual machine objects. And so first, what we're going to do is let's just go ahead, with the SLA assignment so that we can see which SLA group each VM is assigned to. And then what we're going to do next is let's just go ahead and add the Boolean is replication enabled. We're going to take that property so that we can see which VMs are protected by rubric. And just like before, we can update the label, but in this case, we're going to keep the defaults for these two. And in the attribute binding section, we need to tell the management pack builder how to map the VMs from the rubric API response to the existing VMs in VCF operations. And so we're going to select an attribute that matches from each side. And so in this case, we're going to use the MoID attribute from rubric, which corresponds to the VM entity object ID property on the virtual machine object that's inside of VCF operations. And that's it. Now that our management pack has a new object type known as rubric cluster, one of the great things, like I said, is that it also extends the existing VMware VM object type with these two rubric specific properties. And so now that we've got our objects defined, let's go ahead and add a relationship from the rubric cluster to the VMware virtual machines that are under its protection. And so first we're going to select the parent object type, and in this case it'll be the rubric cluster. And then we're going to select the child object type, which is the virtual machine. Next, we need to find the matching properties between the parent and the child objects. And so what we're going to do is we're going to match the ID of the rubric cluster to the primary cluster ID of the virtual machine. Finally, we can customize the name of this relationship. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the name is only for your reference within the management pack builder, And so in this particular case, we're just going to go ahead and leave the default. And that's particularly it for that particular section. And so, what we've done is we've added a new relationship mapping from the rubric cluster to the VMware virtual machine objects. And now it's actually just time to go ahead and test and build our management pack. And it looks like everything is working as expected. And so, since everything looks good, let's just go ahead and build our management pack. And after a few seconds, the build is complete. And to install our new management pack, we can download the pack file and go through the manual management pack installation process within VCF operations, or we can directly deploy to our VCF operations environment. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that installation will take a few minutes. And so for the sake of time, let's just go ahead and skip ahead. And now that installation is complete, we can now see our new management packets available on the repository tab on the integration page within VCF operations. And so with that, let's just go ahead and add an account. We're going to use the same rubric environment that we use while designing the management pack. However, one of the things that I want to point out is that we can actually connect to any rubric system that supports the same API. And with that, now that the account is added, all we have to do is just wait a couple of collection cycles to start to see our new data. So we're going to go ahead and skip ahead here. And now that the adapter has had some time to collect, let's just take a look at our new rubric cluster object. We can see the properties that we defined within the management pack builder, and we can also see the related virtual machines that are managed by this rubric cluster. And if we were to look at one of the VMs, we can see the SLA and the replication properties added to that vCenter VM object. And with that, that's it. I want to thank you for watching this demo of the management pack builder within VCF operations. Thank you.